I was about to sit at the dinner table. My stepmother pushed my chair away. "A military woman doesn't belong in this family." The room went silent. My stepbrother started recording his phone raised like a weapon he'd been waiting years to use. My father stared at his plate. I stood there in my travel clothes still smelling like airport coffee and 11 months of someone else's war, and I felt something inside me go very still, very cold, very calm. I stood up straight. I smiled. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." 3 days earlier, I'd been standing on a tarmac in Germany watching a transport plane fold up the last 11 months of my life into a duffel bag. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I had spent nearly a year running logistics for a battalion that never stopped moving, never stopped needing, never stopped testing what I was made of. I had learned to sleep in 4-hour intervals. I had learned to make decisions that mattered inside 60 seconds. What I had not learned, apparently, was how to walk into my father's dining room and be welcomed. My father called me the week before I came home. His voice had that particular warmth he saved for occasions, the same warmth he'd used at my college graduation and my commissioning ceremony. Moments where love was easy because it came with an audience. "We're doing a family dinner, Leah," he said. "Everyone wants to see you." I should have heard the word everyone for what it was. Not just him, not just us. Everyone now included Linda, his wife of 6 years, and Brian, her son from a previous marriage, a 26-year-old who had never held a job longer than 8 months, and who called himself an entrepreneur the way some men call themselves poets as a way of avoiding the word unemployed. I bought gifts anyway. A leather wallet for my father, the kind he'd admired in a catalog once years ago that I'd never forgotten. A bottle of bourbon for Brian because I still believed foolishly that decency could be modeled rather than demanded. And for Linda, a scarf, soft gray cashmere, chosen with more care than she probably imagined I was capable of. I have always believed that showing up with open hands says something a person can't argue with. I was wrong about that too, as it turned out. Some people don't want your open hands, they want your empty chair. The house looked the same as it always did, pale yellow siding. The porch light my mother had picked out before she died the maple tree I used to climb, until my father told me girls shouldn't be up in trees. My mother has been gone 11 years now, and the ache of that has softened into something more like weather than wound a low-pressure system that moves through on certain days and then moves on. I walked up that porch with a box of gifts and a duffel bag still smelling of jet fuel, and I told myself this would be fine. Family is family, I told myself. That sentence has never once been simple, and it wasn't tonight either. Linda opened the door with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Leah," she said, like my name was something she'd had to practice. Brian was in the living room, feet on the coffee table, phone already in his hand. Though nothing had happened yet, a detail I would only understand the weight of later. My father hugged me the way he always did, quick, a little stiff, a man who loved his daughter, and had never quite learned how to show it without an apology built into the gesture. "You look good," he said, "tired but good." Dinner smelled like it always had in that house on special occasions, roast chicken rosemary, the yeasty warmth of Linda's dinner rolls, which I'll admit were genuinely good, a small strange betrayal of my own resentment. The table was set with the china my mother used to use only at Christmas. Nobody mentioned that. I noticed it the way I notice everything now, a habit the Army gave me that civilian life has never managed to take back. Scan the room, catalog the details. Know where the exits are. Linda talked through most of dinner prep about a reasonable, grounded life, about people who build things with their hands and their minds, rather than playing soldier for a paycheck and a pension. She said this while looking at a spot just past my shoulder, never quite at me, the coward's way of throwing a punch. My father said nothing. Brian smirked into his water glass. I told myself I would let it go. I had faced worse than a woman who resented a stepdaughter she never asked for. Then it was time to sit. I pulled out my chair, the one that had always been mine, the one on my mother's china side of the table, and Linda's hand shot out and pushed it 2 feet to the left, hard enough that it scraped against the hardwood floor like a small scream. "A military woman doesn't belong in this family," she said, loud enough for the whole table, loud enough for God, loud enough that there was no pretending afterward that it had been a joke or a slip. The room went dead silent. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. And Brian lifted his phone and started recording, grinning like a boy who had just been handed the best birthday present of his life. I looked at my father. He looked at his plate. I picked up my gifts, set them gently on the sideboard so as not to give Brian the satisfaction of a dramatic exit, and I stood there for one long moment feeling 11 months of discipline settle into my spine like armor. I smiled, not the tight, polite smile people expect from a woman who's just been humiliated, but something calmer, something that unsettled Linda far more than tears would have. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said, and I walked out into the cold October evening without raising my voice once. Behind me I heard Brian laughing already, imagining how many views his video would get, already believing he'd just captured the moment his uptight, humorless sister finally got what was coming to her. He had no idea what he had actually just done. None of them did. The hotel room was quiet in a way my father's house never had been, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before I did anything at all. I didn't cry. I want to say that plainly because I think people expect a woman who's just been humiliated at her own family's dinner table to fall apart, to call a friend and sob into the phone, to drink too much wine and stare at the ceiling. I didn't do any of that. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to sit still during long convoys and longer briefings, and I let the anger settle into something usable instead of something that would burn me from the inside. What Linda didn't know, what almost none of them knew, was that I wasn't just a soldier who'd wandered off to play at a career my father's wife found embarrassing. My mother, before she died, had built something. She'd been sharp about money in a way people underestimated because she wore cardigans and baked bread, and never once raised her voice in an argument. She'd set aside investments over the years, quiet, patient, unglamorous, and when she passed, control of a good portion of that came to me. Not in a lump sum I could spend on something foolish, but structured, protected, tied up in a trust with conditions she'd written herself. Conditions I hadn't thought much about in years, because I'd never had reason to. I never told my father the details, partly because grief made money feel obscene to talk about in the months after she died, and partly because I watched him remarry within 2 years and understood in the private way children understand their parents without being told that he needed a version of the story, where he'd moved on cleanly, where nothing from his first marriage still had a hand on his life. I let him have that story. I stepped back. I visited on holidays, sent cards, kept my distance, the way you keep distance from a stove you already know is hot, and I told myself that was maturity rather than avoidance. Around midnight my phone started buzzing. A friend from high school, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, sent me a link with 3 exclamation points and no other words. Brian had posted the video. He'd captioned it something like, "When your sister thinks the army makes her better than everyone else," misspelled predictably the word everyone rendered as everyone, which under different circumstances I might have found almost funny. The video had already picked up a few thousand views by the time I watched it. My own face calm and unreadable in the dim light of my father's dining room, Linda's voice sharp and satisfied beside me. The comments split the way comments always do. Some people defended me, called Linda cruel, called Brian pathetic for filming his own sister's humiliation instead of standing up. Others took Linda's side, said something about entitled veterans, said the military wasn't a personality, said a dozen small ugly things that would have stung more if I hadn't spent a career being underestimated by people who had never once had to make a decision that mattered. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't share it, didn't defend myself, didn't post some tearful video of my own explaining my side. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and let it happen without me. That restraint wasn't performance. It was strategy, though. I didn't fully understand my own strategy, yet I only knew with the certainty of someone who has learned not to move until she understands the terrain that reacting now would cost me more than waiting would. The call from my lawyer came the next morning, earlier than I expected, his voice careful in the way lawyers get when they're about to hand you something heavier than small talk. His name was Walter Greaves, a quiet, precise man who had managed my mother's estate since before I'd finished my first deployment, And in 6 years, he had never once called me without warning. "Leah," he said, "we need to talk about the house." I sat up straighter, coffee forgotten. He explained it slowly, the way you explain something to a person you suspect is about to be blindsided. The house my father lived in, the house I'd grown up in, the house with the maple tree and the porch light, my mother chose sat on land that had never actually belonged to my father outright. My mother had placed it along with several other assets into a trust years before she died. A trust designed to protect the property for the family long-term rather than leave it vulnerable to remarriage debt or bad decisions made in grief. My father had a life estate, the right to live there for as long as he wanted undisturbed, but he did not have the right to sell it. Any sale required the signature of the trust's co-trustee. Me, I hadn't thought about that clause in years. I'd signed the original paperwork numbly 24 years old, and freshly grieving, barely reading the language my mother's lawyer had explained to me in careful, gentle sentences. I understood, sitting in that hotel room with the morning light coming in flat and gray through the curtains, exactly why Linda had spent 6 years chipping away at my place in that family. Why every holiday had felt like an audition I kept failing. Why she'd wanted me gone from that dinner table so badly she'd been willing to humiliate me in front of my own father to make it happen. It had never really been about the army at all. "Leah," Walter said, and I could hear him choosing his next words with unusual care. "Someone has already filed paperwork to begin the sale." I met Walter in person 2 days later in his office downtown, the kind of office that hadn't changed its furniture since my mother first sat across that same desk 20 years earlier. He had the file open before I even sat down, a manila folder thick with documents I hadn't looked at since I was a grieving 24-year-old, signing whatever was placed in front of me. "I want to walk you through exactly what's happening," he said, "before you decide anything." I appreciated that about Walter. He had never once tried to tell me how to feel about my own family. He only ever told me the truth and let me arrive at my own conclusions. The picture he laid out was uglier than I expected, though. By then, I don't know why I expected anything else. Linda had been quietly pushing my father toward selling the house for the better part of a year, framing it always as practicality. The place was too big for 2 people, the taxes kept climbing. Wouldn't it be nice to downsize somewhere warmer, somewhere easier? What she never mentioned to him, what she'd apparently gone to some trouble to keep buried, was where the proceeds were actually meant to go. Brian had been developing what he called a business, some vague venture involving imported furniture and an online store that, as far as Walter's preliminary digging could tell, existed mostly as a website and a dream. He needed capital. His mother intended to hand him a piece of my father's house to get it. The trust documents were specific in ways Linda clearly hadn't anticipated, or had hoped my father would never actually read closely. My mother, methodical even in her dying, had built-in language requiring co-trustee approval for any sale, transfer, or major encumbrance of the property, with my signature as the second trustee explicitly required. Somewhere along the way, Linda had either misunderstood this, or, and this felt more likely, given the pattern Walter was uncovering, chosen to believe she could get the paperwork through before anyone thought to check. She'd found a buyer fast, a young couple relocating for a new job, eager and a little naive, exactly the kind of buyers who wouldn't ask too many questions about trustee structures if the price was right and the timeline was tight. Brian, for his part, seemed to have no idea any of this was remotely complicated. He posted about it the way he posted about everything, with more confidence than information. A photo of a gated community 2 towns over captioned something about new beginnings and finally getting what we deserve. A story about test driving a car he clearly couldn't afford yet, tagged with a location at a dealership showroom. He believed, with the total certainty of a man who had never once had to earn anything, the slow way that he was about to be handed enough money to finally become the person he'd always told people he already was. I sat with all of this for a long moment, watching dust drift through the light from Walter's window, and I felt the old army instinct take over the part of me that had learned in convoys and command posts that the worst thing you can do with incomplete intelligence is act on it too early. "The sale is void without my signature," I said. It wasn't a question. Walter nodded. Completely void. No court in this state would uphold a transfer that bypasses a named co-trustee, especially not one this clearly documented. Then I'm not going to stop it, I said. Walter looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look a careful man gives you when he suspects you're about to do something either very smart or very reckless and hasn't yet decided which. You want to let it proceed. I want to let it get as far as the closing table, I said. I want them standing there believing it's done before anyone tells them otherwise. I won't pretend that decision came from a place of pure discipline. Some part of it was anger, an old cold anger that had been sitting in me since a chair scraped against hardwood in front of my own father's silence. But most of it, if I'm honest, was something closer to justice than revenge. A need for the truth to arrive in a room where everyone could see it plainly, rather than in a private phone call. Linda could minimize, or twist into another story about how unreasonable I was being. I had spent 6 years watching her control every narrative in that family with quiet, patient persistence. I wasn't interested in fighting her in whispers. I wanted daylight. I didn't warn my father. That was the hardest part, harder than staying silent through dinner, harder than watching Brian's video rack up comments I refused to read past the first few lines. My father was still in his heart a decent man who had simply never learned how to stand up to the people closest to him. Not to my mother when she was alive, and pushing him toward better choices, and not to Linda now. Warning him meant trusting. He could hold the secret, and some instinct, some old wound, told me he couldn't. So I did the only thing that felt honest under the circumstances. I waited. 3 weeks passed in a strange, watchful quiet. I went back to work, caught up on medical appointments the Army required, saw a few old friends who asked careful questions about the video, and accepted my vague answers without pushing. Meanwhile, Walter kept me updated in short, precise phone calls. The buyers had made an offer. The offer had been accepted. Inspections were scheduled, then completed. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Walter called with the detail that told me the end was closer than I'd thought. They've got a signed purchase agreement, he said. The buyers just put down a deposit, $320,000 held in escrow. He paused. Closing is set for 2 weeks from Friday. The law office where the closing was scheduled sat on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of place with a view meant to make people feel like they were making an important decision, which in this case they very much were, whether they understood that yet or not. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed not in uniform, but in a simple charcoal suit, my hair pulled back the way I wore it for formal briefings, my expression I hoped unreadable. Walter met me in the hallway outside, his face composed, but his eyes carrying the particular energy of a man who has spent 3 weeks quietly building toward a moment he believes in. "You don't have to do this the dramatic way," he said, not for the first time. "I can simply block the filing before anyone gets in the room." "I know," I said, "but they need to see it happen, all of them." He didn't argue further. I think by then he understood something about me that even I hadn't fully articulated yet, that this was never only about stopping a fraudulent sale. It was about a family that had spent years underestimating me, dismissing 11 months of my life spent commanding logistics for hundreds of soldiers as playing at a career, and I needed them to understand in a room with witnesses exactly how much they had misjudged. I waited in a small side office while the closing began, watching through a gap in the door. Linda arrived first, dressed the way she dressed for church or funerals. Something structured and expensive, her chin lifted with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she has already won. Brian trailed behind her phone raised, narrating for an audience that had grown considerably since his last video went semi-viral. "We're here," he said into the camera, grinning. "Closing on the house today, guys. Big day for the family." He had no idea how correct that sentence was about to become. My father arrived last, quieter than the other two, dressed in the same tan jacket he'd worn to my commissioning ceremony years earlier, a detail that struck me harder than I expected it to. He still believed, as far as I could tell, that this was simply a practical transition. An aging man downsizing with his wife's help, nothing more sinister than that. He had no idea his late wife's trust was about to walk through that door in the form of his daughter. The buyers, a young couple named the Ortegas, sat across the table looking cautiously hopeful the way people look when they're about to make the biggest purchase of their lives, and are trying not to let their excitement show too plainly. The closing attorney, a calm older man named Mr. Pham, began working through the paperwork with practiced efficiency, sliding documents across the table for signatures, murmuring the small procedural phrases that fill these rooms: initial here, sign here, and here. Linda signed with a flourish. Brian kept filming, occasionally panning the camera toward his mother with a proud, encouraging grin, as if she were closing a business deal on television. My father signed more slowly, the pen hovering a moment too long over the paper, the only visible sign that some part of him understood this moment carried more weight than he was letting himself feel. Then Mr. Pham paused, flipping back through the stack in front of him, his brow tightening slightly in the particular way of a man who has just noticed something his checklist won't let him ignore. "We are missing one required trustee," he said, more to himself than to the room, scanning the trust documentation a second time. "The property is held under a trust with co-trustee signature requirements. I only have Mr. Thompson's signature here." Linda's smile flickered just barely. "That shouldn't be necessary," she said quickly. "My husband owns the property outright." "According to this document," Mr. Pham said, tapping the page, "he holds a life estate. The trust itself requires the signature of a second trustee for any transfer or sale." He looked up. "Is there someone else who needs to be present?" That was my moment, and I took it without hurrying, walking through the door the way I'd walked into command briefings 100 times before, calm, deliberate, betraying nothing. "That would be me," I said. The room went silent in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. Brian's phone lowered an inch, the live stream still running, still capturing every second of what was about to unfold. A fact he would come to regret bitterly in the weeks ahead. Linda's face drained of color so fast it was almost clinical, her mouth opening slightly before closing again with nothing to say. My father turned toward me with an expression I couldn't fully read: shock, certainly, but underneath it something that looked almost like relief, as if some part of him had been waiting for someone to finally stop this train before it reached the end of the tracks. I set a folder on the table, the documents Walter had prepared weeks earlier, the original trust, my mother's signature at the bottom in the careful looping handwriting I would recognize anywhere, the clause naming me co-trustee with equal authority over any transfer of the property. Mr. Pham reviewed it methodically, and within minutes confirmed what I already knew. The sale, as structured, could not proceed. Not that day, not without my consent, which I made clear. Calmly and without raising my voice, I had no intention of giving. The Ortegas, to their credit, handled the news with more grace than anyone else in the room. But their agent, watching a $300,000 deposit suddenly hang in legal limbo, was considerably less gracious, and by the time everyone filed out of that office, I heard him on the phone in the hallway, voice tight with fury, already using words like misrepresentation and legal action in the same sentence as Linda's name. My father didn't speak on the drive back to the house. I rode with him, Linda and Brian having left separately, in a silence so heavy, even Brian had stopped filming, some instinct finally catching up to him, that this was no longer content, that this was his family actually falling apart in real time. My father gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead in the particular way of a man, trying very hard not to let his face show what he was feeling. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there a long moment before turning off the engine. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about the trust, about any of it." "I know," I said. "Your mother never told me. She told me the week before she died," I said. "I think she knew even then that things might change after she was gone, that people might not stay who they seemed to be." I hadn't meant it as an accusation, but I watched it land on him like one anyway, and I let the silence sit rather than soften it. Some truths don't need softening. They need room to be understood. Walter arrived an hour later with the full file, the same one he'd shown me weeks before, except now he laid it out across my father's kitchen table, piece by piece, patiently, the way you'd walk someone through a diagnosis they weren't prepared for. My father read through it in near silence, occasionally removing his glasses to press his fingers against his eyes, and I watched 11 years of a marriage he'd trusted completely reveal itself as something considerably more complicated than he'd allowed himself to see. There were emails Linda had exchanged with a real estate agent nearly a year earlier, long before she'd ever mentioned downsizing to my father, discussing the property's value and potential buyers, with a specificity that made clear this had never been a spontaneous idea born of practical concerns. There were text messages between Linda and Brian, screenshots the young couple's own agent had actually forwarded to Walter once the deal collapsed and questions started flying about who had known what messages, in which Linda assured her son the sale was basically done, and told him not to worry about the details, that she'd handle Leah's part when the time came. Whatever handling me had meant, it apparently hadn't included telling me anything at all. Worse, buried near the bottom of the file was something Walter had only uncovered in the final days before closing a document purporting to be an old amendment to the trust, supposedly signed by my mother years before her death, granting my father expanded authority to sell the property without co-trustee approval under certain conditions. The signature on it was close enough that a distracted eye might not question it. But Walter, who had spent decades staring at my mother's actual signature on dozens of documents, had flagged it immediately as inconsistent. The pressure wrong, the loop of the L slightly too controlled, too deliberate, the kind of forgery that comes from someone practicing in private rather than signing in the natural rush of a real life. He'd sent it quietly to a document examiner the week before, closing less as an accusation and more as due diligence, and the results had come back only that morning, before we'd even walked into the closing room. Forged. Not with total certainty in every technical sense, the examiner had noted, but with enough confidence that no attorney or court would treat it as authentic. My father set the papers down and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me. "Did you know about this one before today?" "Walter told me an hour before we walked in," I said. I didn't want to believe it either. Brian showed up at the house that evening, uninvited, his face carrying an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the smug confidence of the dinner table video, not the eager grin of his live streams, but something closer to fear. He'd apparently spent the afternoon on the phone with his mother, and whatever she'd told him hadn't matched what he was now hearing from my father in the kitchen. Mom said the trust thing was a formality. He said to no one in particular. She said it was basically already handled. It wasn't a formality, my father said, and his voice had a firmness in it I hadn't heard directed at Linda or Brian in years. It was fraud, Brian. Someone forged your grandmother's signature. I watched something shift in Brian's face, then watched 26 years of unquestioning loyalty to his mother crack under the specific, undeniable weight of a forged document sitting on a kitchen table. He didn't defend her. He didn't say another word, actually, just sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and stared at his hands, and for the first time since I'd known him, I felt something closer to pity than contempt. Linda arrived 20 minutes later, still in her closing day clothes, her composure noticeably thinner than it had been that morning. My father met her at the door before she could even step inside, and I heard his voice through the screen, low and controlled in a way that told me exactly how much restraint it was costing him. "Pack a bag tonight," he said. "I want you out by morning." The internet has a long memory when it wants one, and within days of the closing collapsing, someone connected the dots between Brian's original dinner table video and the growing rumors about a forged trust document circulating in local real estate circles. Someone had recognized my father's street in the background of one of Brian's live streams. Someone else had put together a timeline, and before long the old clip, the one where Linda shoved my chair aside and told me a military woman didn't belong in this family, was resurfacing with a very different caption attached to it. This time people weren't just commenting on a stepmother's cruelty. They were connecting it to a woman who had apparently tried to defraud her own husband and stepdaughter out of a house that had never fully belonged to her. Brian bore the brunt of it first, and in some ways I think that was fair, though I never took pleasure in watching it happen. The comments on his original video, the ones that had once been split fairly evenly between people defending him and people criticizing him, tilted hard and fast in one direction once the fuller story emerged. People pointed out correctly that he'd filmed his own sister's humiliation not because he cared about justice or family loyalty, but because he'd believed it would make good content, would rack up views, would paint him as the clever son in on a joke at my expense. Now that same video was being used as evidence of exactly the kind of person he was, someone who filmed cruelty instead of stopping it. The financial fallout hit him even harder than the public embarrassment. The Ortega's agent, furious at watching a $300,000 deposit tied up in legal limbo because of what he was now calling accurately a fraudulent transaction, filed a formal complaint against Linda with the State Real Estate Commission and separately pursued a civil claim to recover damages and legal costs. Brian's furniture business, the one he'd been counting on funding through his mother's scheme, evaporated before it ever truly existed. No house sale meant no capital. No capital meant no inventory. No inventory meant the whole venture folded quietly. The website taken down within a week. The dream of a gated community, 2 towns over, reduced to a handful of screenshots. People online delighted in reposting with cruel new captions of their own. Linda hired a lawyer almost immediately, a sharp, expensive one from a firm 2 counties over, and I heard through Walter that her defense strategy leaned heavily on distancing herself from the forged document, insisting she'd had no direct knowledge, it wasn't authentic, that she'd simply trusted an old family friend who'd helped locate the paperwork. Whether that was true or not, I honestly couldn't say with certainty, and some part of me suspected I never fully would. What I did know, from the document examiner's findings and the pattern of emails Walter had compiled, was that someone had gone to considerable trouble to make that signature convincing, and Linda had been the only person with a clear motive to want it to exist. My father called me 2 weeks after everything fell apart, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, and asked if I would come by the house. I drove over expecting another conversation about paperwork, about lawyers, about the mechanical business of untangling a marriage from a fraud investigation. Instead, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd once eaten Sunday dinners as a family of 3, before Linda, before Brian, before any of it. He'd made coffee. He didn't drink his. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, not looking up. "The dinner." I didn't say anything. I'd learned over the years that silence was often the more honest response when someone was working their way toward something difficult. "I sat there," he said, "and I watched her push your chair, and I watched Brian film it, and I didn't say a single word." He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since my mother's funeral. I told myself I was keeping the peace. That's what I told myself, that I was just trying to keep things calm. But I wasn't keeping the peace, Leah. I was choosing her comfort over your dignity, and I've had 11 months to figure out how to say that to you. And I still don't know how. I sat down across from him, the coffee between us going cold, and I thought about 11 months in Germany, about all the versions of strength the army had taught me, how to hold a room, how to make a hard call, how to stand perfectly still while someone underestimated me, and let that underestimation become their mistake instead of mine. None of that training had prepared me for this particular moment, my father's voice cracking over a cold cup of coffee, finally saying the thing I'd needed to hear for 6 years. The thing that hurt the most wasn't what she said. I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. It was your silence. I could have handled her. I've handled worse than Linda Thompson. What I couldn't handle was watching my own father look at his plate instead of looking at me. He didn't try to defend himself after that. He just put his face in his hands, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I watched my father cry, not the careful, controlled tears of a funeral, but something raw. Something that had clearly been sitting in him for a long time, waiting for someone to finally give him permission to let it out. I had every legal right to remove my father from that house. As co-trustee, once the fraud was fully documented and Linda's claim to any interest in the property was dissolved, Walter told me plainly that I could restructure the trust, however I saw fit, could sell the property immediately, if I wanted, could even ask my father to find somewhere else to live. If some part of me had wanted to punish him further for 11 months of silence I'd carried like a stone in my chest. I sat with that option for exactly one evening alone in my apartment near base, staring at the ceiling the way I had the night of the dinner. And I understood by morning that I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who used power the way it had just been used against me. I called Walter the next day and asked him to draft an amendment instead. My father would retain his life estate undisturbed for as long as he wanted to live in that house. The porch light my mother had chosen still burning every evening, the maple tree still standing in the side yard, whatever peace remained for him, still intact. But I added something new, something my mother, I think, would have approved of even more than the original trust. Upon my father's passing, the house would be sold, and the full proceeds would fund a scholarship for the children of service members killed in the line of duty, a small permanent thing built out of a story that could have ended in nothing but bitterness. My father cried again when I told him, though more quietly this time, more like relief than grief. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "After everything." "I know," I said. "That's why I did it." Brian came to see me about a month later, driving out to the small town near my base in a car considerably less impressive than the one he'd been test driving in his old posts. He looked different, thinner, somehow quieter. A young man who had spent several weeks watching his mother's life come apart on a public stage he himself had helped build. He apologized, and I believed him mostly because the apology came without any request attached to it. No ask for money. No ask for a second chance at the business, just a plain halting admission that he'd been cruel and careless, and that he understood now exactly what he'd cost people, including himself. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it. But I also told him gently that forgiveness and closeness were two different things, and that I didn't know if I'd ever fully trust him the way family is supposed to trust each other. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Like some part of him already knew he hadn't yet earned anything more. Linda's case moved through the system slower than any of us expected, the way these things often do. The Real Estate Commission suspended proceedings pending the outcome of the forgery investigation, and the Ortega's civil suit against her dragged into the following spring, ending eventually in a settlement that cost her far more than the profit she'd been chasing. I heard secondhand that she'd moved to a small apartment 2 towns over, that she and my father finalized their divorce quietly, without the dramatics that had defined so much of their marriage's final year. I never spoke to her again after that night at the closing table, and I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will. I went back to my unit that spring, back to the particular rhythm of a life spent in service to something larger than my own family drama, and I found myself thinking more than once about the strange shape justice had taken in this story. I hadn't sued anyone out of spite. I hadn't posted my own video, hadn't fought Linda's cruelty with cruelty of my own, hadn't given Brian the satisfaction of watching me lash out the way his video had clearly hoped I would. I had simply waited quietly for the truth to walk into a room on its own and let it stand there in front of everyone until there was nothing left to argue about. The morning I drove back to base, my father walked me out to my car the way he used to when I first left for basic training all those years ago, standing in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, watching me load the last of my things into the trunk. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, and his voice didn't crack this time, steady in a way it hadn't been in months. I looked back at the house one last time. The yellow siding, the porch light, the maple tree with its branches bare and waiting for spring, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in a long time, something that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite triumph, but sat somewhere honest between the two. I had lost a stepmother I never wanted, and a stepbrother I might never fully trust again. But I had gotten something back that mattered more, a father who finally understood what his silence had cost, and the quiet certainty that some inheritances aren't about money or houses at all. They're about who chooses in the end to stand up for you when it matters, and who simply looks down at their plate. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Have you ever had to wait quietly for the truth to speak for itself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I'm always amazed by how many of you carry stories just like this one. We share stories like Leah's every single day here, real, raw, and full of the kind of justice that doesn't always come fast but always comes fair. If you want to keep walking these journeys with me, Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.